Hi everyone. I have a few notes that I want to share with you about Chapter 6, Writing for Your Readers. Um, Mostly I'm not talking about grammar. The textbook does a wonderful job about that. This is really about the content and ways that you can make sure that you have good content that's quality and provides the kinds of information that you want your readers to get. So just an overview of Chapter 6. You want to present yourself effectively, use basic organizational patterns, write clear, informative titles and headings, write clear, informative paragraphs, write grammatically correct sentences, structure effective sentences, and choose the right words and phrases. There are different organizational patterns, and the textbook again goes into depth explaining these to you, and it's pretty important that you understand them because they are appropriate for different kinds of descriptions or information depending. So for example, there's chronological, spatial, general to specific, more to less important, comparison and contrast, classification or participation, problems, method, solution, and cause and effect. So a chronological organization pattern would be you're providing instructions, and so you're saying this is step 1, this is step 2, this is step 3, this is step 4. Spatial might be describing the way something looks. So the first thing you see is this, the next thing you will see is this. General to specific, you start with the big picture and then you hone it down. And then more important to less important, that's sort of the information triangle where you start with the most important details. That's the same pattern that newspaper articles are written in. You get the big pieces of information first, and then it goes down to the less important information at the bottom of the article. Comparison and contrast, you know what that is. You can compare how two things are alike or compare their similarities and their differences. Classification is putting something into a group, so grouping like items, and partition would be breaking them into pieces and showing the different parts of them. Problems, methods, and solution. Here's the problem. Here's the method I used to create this solution. And then cause and effect. If you do this, then this will happen. So those are different kinds of patterns. The next is revising headings. You want to avoid long noun strings, and the textbook gives you some good examples of this, but you don't want noun, 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 noun. Thomas Nelson Community College is a long noun string, even though it's a proper noun, and we have shortened it now so that it's just Thomas Nelson. You want your headings to be informative. Make sure that they are precise and that they explain exactly what information is to follow. Use the appropriate grammatical format. And avoid back-to-back headings. You don't want one heading and then another heading. The pattern is heading, information, heading, and information. There are different kinds of paragraphs. There's a body paragraph, which is what you're probably used to or what you've written the most in English 111. Those are the traditional paragraph, and that's a group of sentences that is complete in and of itself and contributes to a larger discussion. So it's just the main idea of something. And a transitional paragraph can be think of it more of like filler information, and it leads your reader to the next point. So it might be some background information that the reader needs, but it's not, it leads you on to something else, where a body paragraph can stand alone. Most paragraphs contain two elements. The first is the topic sentence or the main idea of the paragraph, and it explains what the point of the paragraph is. And then what follows that is the supporting information. One of the ways I like to talk about paragraphs is they're like essays. In English 111, you likely learned that you had an introduction, you had 3 body paragraphs, and you have a conclusion. Well, a well-written paragraph is exactly the same. It has an introductory or a topic sentence, an introduction. It has supporting information or evidence, which are the body, similar to the body paragraphs, and then it has a conclusion which sums up what the paragraph's about, or it can transition and lead the reader to the next paragraph. So really essays, paragraphs, think of paragraphs as like a mini essay in and of itself. So some ideas of about, or some information about supporting information. Supporting information defines key terms or ideas that are included in the topic sentence. It's your evidence or your details and information. It can be examples or illustrations. It can identify reasons or factors that have caused a situation to occur, or the effects or implications of something happening. But the most important thing is that it supports the topic sentence, and that is why it's called supporting information. The one thing that you don't want to do in technical writing is hide the bad news. So you really need to make sure that if you're sharing bad news or unpleasant information, numbers that you think your boss isn't going to be happy to see, don't hide them. That can be considered less than ethical. So the most emphatic location in a paragraph is the topic sentence. That's what we pay the most attention to. We pay the most attention to the first sentence and the last sentence. So burying the bad news is when you stick it somewhere in the middle of the paragraph. So if you want to draw your reader's attention to information, when you want to do that, you put it either at the very beginning of the paragraph or the very end of the paragraph. To strengthen your paragraph's coherence, add transitional words or phrases, repeat key words. You don't want to be redundant, but you do want to use the same terminology throughout. You want to call a key ring and not a key fob, because that could confuse your audience at some times. And use demonstrative pronouns followed by nouns. So make sure that when you have a pronoun, you have the noun close by, so it's very clear to the reader what that pronoun is referring to, what noun it is referring to. So here's some examples of traditional words and phrases. Again, this is in your textbook, but it gives you an idea of, like, if you want to add things or cause and effect or any of those reasons. These are some phrases that are traditionally considered signal phrases. They let your reader know that you're comparing something when you say likewise or similarly or in the same way, or you're talking about time or space when you use words like above, around, earlier, later, next. Or you're summarizing something when you say at last or finally or in conclusion or to conclude or to summarize. So those are all signal phrases that let your reader know, okay, this is what's happening, now I know what's going on. When you're structuring effective sentences, use lists. I am a big fan of bullets. You will see that I use them throughout the course. I think that using lists is a really quick and easy way to get information across. It keeps me from being wordy and going on forever, as I'm doing now. Always emphasize new and important information. Choose the appropriate sentence length. This is audience appropriate. If you're talking to a technical audience, then a longer sentence length is appropriate. If you are writing for a general audience, then you may want a shorter sentence length. Focus on the real subject and the real verb. Make sure that those are the most important parts of your sentence and that they are clear. Always use parallel structure and use modifiers effectively, okay? So some guidelines for creating effective lists. Set off each item listed with a number, a letter, or a symbol, usually a bullet. Generally, I will use either numbers or bullets, just because that's what I do. Letters are certainly appropriate if you prefer them. I feel like numbers are just, I don't know, they just seem a little bit more specific. Break up long lists. If you've got lists, 20 items in a list, break them up into 4 or 5 sub lists with various headings. And that makes it easier for the reader to find information and to understand the connections between different items. Present your items in parallel structure. So parallel structure, if you notice that these lists, these are all verbs: set, break, present, structure, punctuate. These are all verbs. It doesn't say setting off each list or breaking up long lists. It's all a consistent format throughout. Structure and punctuate the lead in correctly. If you have a long list, as you can see at the heading of this, there's a colon, then we've got our bullets, and we've got our lists, and we've got a period after each item. So that leads to the final bullet point, which is punctuate the list correctly. If you've got a complete sentence, then make sure you use a period at the end of your list. Use parallel structure. Well, I just gave you some examples of that, but you want to use the same grammatical form throughout the list. All of the clauses either have to be passive or active. The verbs either have to be infinitives or participles or so on. So you either use to get, to do, or you just use get and do. The reason we use parallel structure is it creates a recognizable pattern, and it's easier to read. It's just easier for your brain to follow a parallel structure. If I have used the same grammatical form and then structuring creates a recognizable pattern, that's a little bit more confusing to the reader and a little bit more difficult to follow. Use the right words and phrases. Select the appropriate level of formality. We'll talk about that in a minute. Be clear and specific. Again, that's something as technical writers that we're always working on, as well as conciseness. And don't use offensive language or use inoffensive language. That can be challenging because we don't always know what is going to be offensive, but there are a few general guidelines that you can follow. So there's 3 main levels of formality. We have informal, like you're talking to a friend. Moderately formal, which would be a coworker that you're not really close to. If you're sending out an email that could potentially be shared with people, you would definitely be moderately formal. And highly formal is what we use in reports, any kind of communication that has the potential of being a legal document or something that's going to be used outside of the company. So that's kind of just a basic use of rule of thumb. And then you'll also want to use the level and tone that's appropriate for your audience, your topic, and your purpose. Again, general audience, very different from a technical audience. Depending on your subject matter. If you're talking about cleaning the, I can't think of the name of it. If you're talking about cleaning the lunchroom as opposed to a procedure for filing travel claims, those are different kinds of subjects. So they're going to have different tones. You could probably joke if you were talking about keeping the lunchroom clean, whereas if you're talking about travel claim procedures, you want to be pretty concise and to the point and right on topic. And again, what's your purpose? Is it to provide information? Is it, are you informing? Are you changing rules or policy? Are you setting policy? So what is your goal in the communication? So all of those will impact the formality of your communication. Again, writing clearly and specifically, use active and passive voice appropriately. I highly recommend using active voice, pretty consistently. There are some times when passive voice is appropriate, but if you use active voice, you're almost always going to be good. Be specific. Make sure that your readers know exactly what you are talking about. Avoid unnecessary jargon. If you can say it in the plainest, simplest terms, then do so. Use positive constructions. Avoid using the word not. Avoid using contractions like don't and isn't. Avoid long noun strings. So right here, this is an example of using a positive construction. So rather than saying do not use long noun strings, I say avoid long noun strings. Avoid cliches and avoid euphemisms. Euphemisms, you don't want to say someone passed away. Of course, that's not really, it doesn't quite work as an example, but say a euphemism is someone passed away rather than saying someone died. And you really want to be specific and say this person is dead. You don't want to say they passed away. And cliches, because you can frequently work with different cultures, and people have different understandings and different levels of familiarity with cliches, you just want to avoid them in technical communication. Always use the active voice unless the agent is unknown. If you don't know who is doing something, then passive voice would be appropriate. If the action is more important than who is doing the action, or if the reference to the agent might in some way be embarrassing, dangerous, or inappropriate. So for those of you who aren't quite clear on what the active voice is, I'll give you an example. The active voice, an active sentence would be the dog barks. Okay? The dog is my subject, and what the dog did is bark. So the dog barks. The dog barked. If I say barking is the dog, then my subject now becomes barking, and is my verb. I'm sorry. Is barking is still my subject, but it's at the beginning of the sentence, and it hides or makes the subject, the dog, which comes at the end, less clear. So it's just easier, it's more natural to say the dog is barking or the dog barks than rather barks does the dog. It just doesn't quite work. Avoid unnecessary jargon. Again, it's imprecise, it's confusing, it can seem condescending to people who are not, or intimidating to people that are unfamiliar with it. So always use the correct term when you are identifying something. Now, in some places, in the military, jargon is part of how they communicate. I mean, there are certain jargon terms that are used. The example I always like to give is when I was a young girl, my dad was in the Navy, and we were on his ship visiting him, and I had to go to the restroom, and I said, I need to go to the bathroom, Dad, where is it? And he said, the head is down the hall. I had no clue of what he was talking about. But those of you familiar with the military, the head is another term for the bathroom. I had no idea. That's an example of jargon, okay? So you never know what your audience knows, or unless you know what your audience knows, go for the precise term rather than the jargon. Again, be concise. Avoid obvious statements, avoid filler, avoid unnecessary prepositional phrases, avoid wordy phrases, avoid fancy words. Big words are not necessarily impressive, especially if you're not using them correctly. Obvious statements. I wrote about this in the Notes on Graded Assignment at length. You want to, in my opinion, I think, I feel, I believe, all that kind of stuff you just don't need in technical communication. You just want to say something is what it is. I believe the desk is dirty. Okay? No, the desk is dirty. It's concise, it's to the point, it's telling the person exactly what you think. The person already knows that this is what you think because you're stating it. So simply by the act of writing it, it is already implied that this is your thoughts, this is your research, these are your ideas. So you don't need to repeat that. That isn't necessary. Avoid sexist language. And this can be difficult or frustrating. So replace male gender words with non-gender specific words. And you do that with female gender words as well. So rather than saying waitress, you would say server. Um, Switch to a different form of the verb. Switch to the plural. So if you don't want to say the waiter or the server, um, you might say the servers, they, rather than the server, he. Um, that way you don't have to use the he or she or he slash she or she slash he or his or her constructions. So you can just switch to the plural and then use the pronoun they. Address the reader directly. Alternate, and then another option is to alternate with he or she. I find that a little confusing when I read one paragraph that says he or one sentence that refers to a person as he and then the next sentence refers to the person as she. As a reader, I don't like that, but it will depend on your company and their specific guidelines. But it's always easier to get a non-gendered term if you can, or use the plural of the term. And then the pronoun can be they. And finally, use the people first approach. So you don't want to talk about the person's disability first, um, and you don't want to confuse handicap with disability. Don't refer to victimization. Don't refer to a person as wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair. It's just a person. And don't refer to people with disabilities as abnormal. Consider people who are different from you as people who have specific differences. But it's just good form to be as respectful as you possibly can and to focus on the person rather than their disability. Okay? So, if you have questions about this, you know where to post them, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.